The engines started one at a time. Each one whined, sputtered, banged for what seemed like far too long, then caught, broke into a deep, reassuring roar, and settled. 4 times over. 4 Wright cyclones, 4,000 horsepower on each wing, and a tremor running through the cabin floor that you felt in your chest before the wheels ever left the ground. That was the Lockheed Constellation, the airplane with the dolphin-curve and the triple tail. The airplane Howard Hughes secretly commissioned because he wanted passengers to stop on the tarmac and stare. They did. For a little more than a decade, they stopped and stared. And then, almost overnight, nobody wanted her anymore. This is her story. Picture this. It's June 1939. A warm Los Angeles evening. 3 men from the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation have been summoned. Not to an office, not to a boardroom, but to a private residence in Hancock Park. The home belongs to Howard Hughes, and he has something on his mind. Hughes had recently bought his way into transcontinental and western air, TWA, as most people called it. He wasn't a man who bought things to leave them as they were. He wanted to reshape American aviation, and to do that, he needed a weapon, not a gun, not a bomb, an airplane. The most extraordinary airplane anyone had ever seen. That evening, Hughes laid out his demands to Lockheed President Robert Gross, Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard, and a young research engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, a man who would go on to design the U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird, but who, in the summer of 1939, was still making his name. What Hughes wanted sounded impossible. A pressurized airliner that could carry 40 passengers. Non-stop range of 3,500 miles. A cruising speed above 300 miles per hour, faster, at that moment, than most military fighters. And it had to fly above 20,000 feet, up where the air was thin and the weather couldn't touch it. Oh, and one more thing. It had to be beautiful. Not functional beautiful. Not beautiful for an airplane. Beautiful the way a sculpture is beautiful. Or a racing yacht. Or a woman in an evening gown. Hughes wanted passengers to stop on the tarmac and stare. He wanted people who had never given an airplane a second thought to look up and feel something. The secrecy that followed bordered on the absurd. In internal communications, Hughes was referred to by the code name God. Jack Fry, TWA's president, was Jesus Christ. Meetings happened on park benches, never in offices. Hughes insisted that Lockheed sell the first 35 aircraft exclusively to TWA, locking out every competitor, Pan Am, American, Eastern, all of them, for roughly 2 years. On July 10, 1940, the order went through. 40 aircraft at approximately $425,000 each, about $18 million, bankrolled through the Hughes Tool Company. It was the largest commercial aircraft order in history. When someone pointed out that TWA couldn't actually afford to pay for the planes, Hughes reportedly shrugged. "Hell, TWA can't pay. The airline's broke. Go ahead and build 40. I'll pay for them myself." And so it began. In a Burbank hangar behind closed doors, Lockheed started building the airplane that would change commercial aviation. Hall Hibbard captured the moment perfectly when he said that before the Constellation they'd been sort of small-time guys, but when they got to this project, they had to become big-time guys. "We had to be right," he said, "and we had to be good." They were both. The secret held for months until the Wartime Production Board showed up for a routine inspection of Lockheed's Burbank facility and stumbled upon the prototype. Word spread fast. Juan Trippe, the legendary head of Pan American Airways, immediately ordered 22 Constellations at $750,000 apiece. The arms race that Hughes had ignited was on. Now, let me tell you about the airplane itself. Because the Constellation didn't just fly differently from everything that came before it. It looked different. It looked like nothing that had ever taken to the sky. Can you picture it? A fuselage that curved like a dolphin, rising gently from the nose, swelling to its widest point amidships, then tapering gracefully toward the tail. No straight lines anywhere. every surface a compound curve. An engineer named Ward Beeman designed that profile. And here's the remarkable thing. No two bulkheads were the same shape. Every frame, every cross-section was unique. The skin had to be pressed into curves so complex that no aircraft manufacturer has attempted anything like it since. And then there were the three tails. People assumed they were there for beauty. They weren't. Kelly Johnson chose 3 vertical stabilizers for the most practical reason imaginable. A single tail fin, large enough to stabilize an aircraft this size, wouldn't fit inside TWA's existing maintenance hangars at Kansas City Municipal Airport. 3 shorter fins solved the problem and accidentally created the most iconic silhouette in aviation history. That's worth pausing over. The shape that made the Constellation instantly recognizable from a mile away, the shape that graced 1,000 postcards and 100 airline advertisements, the shape that people still point to and call the most beautiful thing that ever flew. It was born from the height of a hangar door in Kansas City. Sometimes beauty arrives through the back entrance. The rest of the aircraft was equally ambitious. 4 Wright R 3350 duplex. Cyclone engines, each one an 18-cylinder radial power plant, displacing 3,350 cubic inches. Enormous engines, temperamental engines, engines that would cause more headaches than anyone imagined. But we'll get to that. A wingspan of 123 feet. Tall tricycle landing gear that gave the Constellation a proud nose-up stance on the ground, as if it were already straining to take off. And those curves, 10 feet, 9 inches wide at the broadest point of the fuselage, the cabin narrowing fore and aft in a profile that cost a fortune to manufacture. Every other airliner used, and would continue to use, a simple cylindrical tube. Cheaper to build, stronger under pressurization, far more sensible. But Howard Hughes hadn't asked for sensible. He'd asked for beautiful. And what Lockheed delivered was something that stopped people in their tracks. The question of who deserved the credit became its own small drama. Hughes wanted to be known as the creator of the Constellation's design. Kelly Johnson, who had actually done the engineering, was furious. Engineer Robert Rummel eventually brokered a compromise. Hughes would say he had conceived the airplane while Johnson designed it. But privately, Hughes confided to Rummel that he had difficulty understanding the difference between conception and design. Lockheed would build 856 Constellations in various forms between 1943 and 1958. The original L049 grew into the L649, the L749, the stretched L1049 Super Constellation, and finally the L1649. A starliner, each one longer, more powerful, more capable than the last. But the essential shape never changed. That dolphin curve. Those 3 tails. From the first prototype to the last starliner, the Constellation was unmistakable. And now came the matter of getting her into the sky. To understand what the Constellation meant to the people who flew on it, you have to understand what flying was like before it. It wasn't pleasant. Before the Constellation, commercial aircraft couldn't fly much above 10,000 feet. That meant flying through the weather, not above it. Turbulence wasn't occasional, it was expected. Passengers were thrown about in their seats. Air sickness bags weren't a courtesy. They were a necessity. At altitude, the cold crept through the cabin walls. Ears ached from pressure changes that had no remedy. On the longest flights, crews handed out supplemental oxygen masks, the kind you might imagine in a hospital, not on an airplane. The Douglas DC-4, the workhorse of the immediate post-war years, flew the route from New York to San Francisco in 13 to 14 hours of relentless, bone-shaking discomfort. You arrived exhausted, queasy, and grateful to be back on the ground. The Constellation changed all of that. She was the first pressurized airliner that regular people could actually fly. The Boeing 307 Stratoliner had technically earned that distinction before the war, but its pressurization system was removed during military service, and by 1946, the handful of surviving Stratoliners were curiosities, not contenders. The Constellation stood alone. Her cabin was pressurized to 5.5 pounds per square inch, enough to maintain comfortable conditions while cruising at 20,000 feet, sometimes 25,000. Up there, above 90% of the weather, the ride was smooth. The air was calm. The terrible vibrations and sudden drops that passengers had learned to dread simply went away. Lockheed had tested the fuselage pressure vessel inside a makeshift altitude chamber built from an old oil storage tank, pushing it to withstand conditions equivalent to 55,000 feet. They weren't taking chances. The Constellation also introduced hydraulically boosted flight controls, aviation's equivalent of power steering, adapted from Kelly Johnson's work on the P-38 Lightning fighter. The aircraft's Fowler flaps were essentially scaled-up P-38 components. The result was an aircraft that, despite its size, handled with a responsiveness that pilots loved. Kelly Johnson himself had been aboard the maiden flight on January 9, 1943. Pilot Milo Burcham lifted the prototype off the runway at Burbank and flew it to Muroc Field, now Edwards Air Force Base, for 58 minutes. It worked. It worked beautifully, but the military had other plans. After Pearl Harbor, the Army requisitioned every L-049 on Lockheed's order book. The airplane Hughes had designed to carry cocktail-sipping passengers across the Atlantic would spend the war years as the C-69, a military transport. Only 22 were built before VJ Day. Then came the stunt. On April 17, 1944, Hughes and Jack Fry climbed into the cockpit of the second production C-69 and flew it from Burbank to Washington National Airport in 6 hours and 57 minutes, a transcontinental speed record, averaging 331 miles per hour. Hughes, characteristically, flew barefoot. "To get a better feel of the plane," he explained. Fry chomped on his trademark cigar. The New York Times would call the flight an outline of the ship of things to come in air transportation. There was a catch. The aircraft belonged to the military. Hughes had secretly flown it to Las Vegas the day before, where TWA personnel repainted it in the airline's red and black livery. When it arrived in Washington with TWA blazing on the fuselage, General Hap Arnold and the military brass were not amused. But the best part of the story came 9 days later, on the return trip. The Constellation stopped at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, and a 72-year-old man climbed slowly aboard. Orville Wright, the man who, with his brother, had achieved powered flight over the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk more than 4 decades earlier. Orville sat at the controls and flew the Constellation over Dayton for 50 minutes, the last flight of his life. He noticed that the airplane's wingspan, at 123 feet, was longer than the 120-foot distance of his first powered flight in 1903. Think about that for a moment. The distance the Wright Flyer covered on its maiden flight wouldn't have reached from wingtip to wingtip of the Constellation. And now, the man who had started it all was sitting at the controls of an aircraft that could cross a continent in 7 hours. "I guess I ran the whole plane for a minute," Wright said afterward, "but I let the machine take care of itself. I always said airplanes would fly themselves if you left them alone." Within 2 years, the Constellation would be carrying paying passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. Let's step aboard. It's 1950. You've come to LaGuardia Field in New York, and you're dressed for the occasion because flying, in 1950, was an occasion. A round-trip ticket to London cost approximately $711, which translates to something like $9,240 in today's money. The median American salary hovered between $3,000 and $5,000 a year. 80% of Americans had never been on an airplane at all. So you weren't an ordinary person. You were a diplomat, perhaps, a business executive, a film star heading to a location shoot. Or maybe you'd saved for years, because the idea of crossing the Atlantic by air, of arriving in London or Paris in less than a day, instead of the 5 days an ocean liner required, felt like the future. And you wanted to be part of it. You walked across the open tarmac, no jetway, no enclosed corridor, just you, the wind, the smell of high-octane aviation gasoline sharp in the air, and the Constellation sitting there in front of you, gleaming, that dolphin curve, those 3 tails, the tall landing gear giving it that proud head-up posture, like a horse ready to run. You climbed the external air stairs and stepped inside. And here is where the world changed. Howard Hughes had commissioned Raymond Loewy, the man who designed the Lucky Strike cigarette package, the Studebaker Avanti, the interior of Skylab, to create the Constellation's cabin for TWA. Loewy didn't design an aircraft interior. He designed an experience. 4 abreast seating, 2 on each side of the aisle, with 36 to 40 inches of legroom in first class. Air France upholstered their seats in brick red wool. TWA installed artist Mario Zamparelli's murals in the Starlight Lounge, 8x4-foot paintings depicting 25 destinations around the world, with gold leather banquettes where passengers gathered for cocktails before dinner. Because of the dolphin fuselage and the nose-high landing gear, walking forward in the cabin meant walking slightly uphill. It was a small thing, a subtle thing, but passengers noticed. The cabin had a kind of architectural character that a simple tube never would. And then came dinner. This is the part that's hardest to describe without it sounding like exaggeration. It isn't. A former Pan Am stewardess named Barbara Braunstein remembered the standard first-class meal as 7 courses, served on 2-tiered carts, dressed with linen and flowers. Dinner service lasted 3 hours, 7 courses, 3 hours at 20,000 feet. The Pan Am President's Special Dinner on a transatlantic crossing proceeded like this: cocktails and canapés to start. Then beluga caviar with toast points and crème, fraîche. Foie gras and hors d'oeuvre. A salad mixed tableside by the stewardess. The entrée, filet mignon, or lobster, or roast duckling bigarade, depending on the night. Pan Am rotated 9 different menus so that frequent flyers never saw the same dinner twice in 9 days. After the entrée, a cheese and fruit cart, then profiteroles au chocolat, or a destination-themed dessert, and finally cognac or Cointreau with coffee. The wines were not afterthoughts. Charles Heidsieck, Blanc de Blanc Champagne, Chateau Haut-Briand with the main course. Served in Swedish crystal glassware, on Rosenthal fine bone china from Germany, with International Silver Company flatware. TWA's Royal Ambassador China became so popular that the airline sold it through in-flight catalogues. Pan Am used Noritake ceramic dinnerware from Japan. Olympic Airways, Aristotle Onassis' airline, served first class with gold-plated cutlery. Real linen tablecloths, cloth napkins, flowers on the service carts. And the smell, can you imagine it? The warm, rich aroma of roast beef drifting forward from the galley, mingling with wool and leather and, yes, cigarette smoke. Every seat had its own ashtray. Smoking was universal, unrestricted, and assumed. A BOAC pilot once noted with dry understatement that after an 8-hour flight, during which passengers did little but snooze, read, drink and smoke, the atmosphere became fairly rich. TWA carved roast beef au jus from an aisle trolley, the stewardess slicing it at each passenger's seat. They served Chateaubriand, veal piccata, lobster thermidor, smoked Nova Scotia salmon. If your passport revealed it was your birthday, they baked you a cake. Pan Am contracted Maxims of Paris for Atlantic catering and eventually installed electronically heated quartz grills in the galley so steaks could be cooked to order, 7 minutes per steak at altitude, in a kitchen the size of a closet. Foods with strong flavours, raw onion, garlic, were omitted from the tiny space. There simply wasn't room for the smell. Even the economy passengers ate well. Pan Am's Rainbow Tourist Service offered stuffed guinea hen and chicken vol au vent. This was coach class. And somewhere between the caviar course and the cheese cart, as the Constellation hummed along at 300 miles per hour with the darkness of the Atlantic 2 miles below, you might have looked up from your Chateau Aubriand and noticed the peculiar blue flame trailing from the engine nacelles just beyond your window. The exhaust glow of 4 Wright cyclones, working hard in the cold night air. Beautiful and faintly unsettling in equal measure. But we haven't yet talked about the journey itself, the 20 hours, the 2 stops, the Black Atlantic at midnight, and the little airport in Ireland where they invented a drink to warm you when you arrived. That story begins in Newfoundland, at a place called Gander. A transatlantic crossing on a Constellation was not a flight. It was a journey. And like all proper journeys, it unfolded in stages, each with its own rhythm, its own atmosphere, its own particular beauty. The New York to Paris route took somewhere between 16 and 20 hours, depending on the winds, the aircraft variant, and the number of times God or the engines decided to test everyone's nerves. There were 2 mandatory refueling stops, one in Newfoundland, one in Ireland, and each stop was its own small adventure. Let's take the trip. You've finished your 7-course dinner. The stewardess has cleared the Rosenthal china and the crystal glassware. The cabin lights have dimmed. Outside your window, the last glow of the eastern seaboard has faded behind you, and ahead there is nothing but darkness. The 4 engines hold their steady, rumbling note, a sound you've already grown accustomed to, the way you grow accustomed to the beating of your own heart. Beneath you, invisible, the North Atlantic stretches toward Europe. 5 or 6 hours out of New York, the engines change pitch. The nose dips slightly. You're descending toward Gander, Newfoundland, a tiny town in the boreal forest that, in the late 1940s and 1950s, was one of the most important places in the world. They called it the crossroads of the world, and it wasn't an exaggeration. Every propeller-driven aircraft crossing the Atlantic stopped at Gander. At its peak, 13,000 aircraft and 250,000 passengers passed through each year. The town existed because of its airport, and the airport existed because the Atlantic was too wide for any propeller airliner to cross in a single hop. In winter, and winter in central Newfoundland lasted a long time, the snow piled up in walls along the taxiways. One KLM passenger remembered looking out the Constellation's windows during the taxi and not being able to see over the snowbanks on either side. Bulldozers had cleared the runways, but everything beyond them was buried. You stepped off the aircraft into cold that seized your lungs. Across the tarmac, into the terminal, a surprisingly handsome modernist building furnished with pieces by Charles and Ray Eames. For 45 minutes to an hour and a half, you stretched your legs, bought coffee, watched other Constellations and DC-6 arrive and depart from airlines you might not have heard of: Cubana, Avianca, Sabina, Iceland Air. Gander was the great mixing bowl of post-war aviation. Everyone came through, then back aboard. Engines started again, that familiar sequence, each one whining, sputtering, banging, for what seemed like far too long before catching and settling into its reassuring roar. 4 times, one after the other. And then the longest leg of the journey began. Gander to Shannon, Ireland. Roughly 6 hours over open ocean. No landmarks below. No turning back. Somewhere past the midpoint, you crossed what crews called the point of no return. where it became shorter to continue to Ireland than to reverse course to Newfoundland. Passengers knew about this. It was noted quietly in the cabin. A small psychological weight that settled over you as you flew further from one continent and closer to another. Night deepened. For those fortunate enough to have booked sleeper berths, this was when the magic happened. The berths followed the Pullman Railroad model. Upper berths folded down from above the windows. Lower berths were fashioned from paired facing seats that converted into a flat bed. Pullman-style privacy curtains screened each sleeper from the aisle. Airlines provided proper mattresses, real sheets, wool blankets, and pillows. A young American named Mariana Gosnell, a secretary with the Foreign Service, described her sleeper berth experience in 1955. The stewardess led her down the aisle to what she called as unexpected a sight as a piano, a bed sticking out of the wall. She wriggled into her pajamas, put her hair up in pin curls, and lay there just beneath the airplane ceiling, too excited to sleep. From time to time, she peered through the porthole at total blackness, night over the Atlantic Ocean. Below her, she could hear passengers still awake, drinking and talking and laughing in their seats. What a scene! Lying in a bed, in pajamas and pin curls, 2 miles above the Atlantic, watching absolute darkness through a porthole while a party carried on beneath you. TWA had launched an all-sleeper luxury service called the Paris Sky Chief in October 1948, an entire aircraft configured as a flying dormitory, New York to Paris. Can you imagine the quiet aboard that flight at 2 a.m? The hum of the engines, the creak of the airframe, the rustle of sheets, and outside, nothing. Nothing at all. For those who didn't have berths, and most passengers didn't, there were other ways to pass the time. The cocktail lounge was the cabin's social heart. TWA's Starlight Lounge, with its Zamparelli murals and gold banquettes, functioned as a kind of airborne drawing room. Passengers and crew gathered there for drinks, conversation, cards. Pan Am stewardess Susie Smith remembered sharing the lounge with Vincent Price one flight, Walter Cronkite another, Princess Grace of Monaco on a third, and the cockpit was open, not metaphorically. The cockpit door was unlocked, and a flight attendant might bring a nervous businessman or a wide-eyed child up front to meet the crew. TWA flight engineer Bob Trumpolt remembered it fondly. The captain would tailor his chat to each visitor, sending the businessman back looking happier and the youngster enthralled with all the noise, lights, dials and excitement in the wheelhouse. One 10-year-old boy who visited the cockpit of a TWA Super Constellation during takeoff from Columbus in 1961 went on to fly professionally for 40 years. We don't know how many pilots were born in those cockpit visits, but it must have been more than a few. Somewhere past 3 a.m, with the cabin mostly dark and the Atlantic still rolling invisibly below, the first grey light appeared on the eastern horizon. Europe was ahead. Ireland was close. Shannon, Ireland, the world's first duty-free airport, established in 1947, greeted transatlantic passengers with warmth they desperately needed. After 6 hours in the vibrating cabin of a propeller aircraft, crossing a black ocean in the small hours, you were cold and tired and stiff. Shannon knew this. The terminal restaurant served the drink that the airport had literally invented for this purpose: Irish coffee, created by chef Joe Sheridan, to warm, exhausted Constellation passengers stumbling off the tarmac at dawn. The duty-free shop, deliberately positioned between the lounge and the restaurant so you had to walk through it, offered Irish whiskey at $1.50 a bottle, Rosenthal porcelain, Leica cameras. Passengers bought gifts for people they'd left behind in New York and people they hadn't yet met in Paris. After Shannon, the final leg to London or Paris lasted about 3 hours. By the time you landed, 20 hours or so after you'd left New York, you had crossed an ocean, slept in a bed at altitude, eaten 7 courses, visited 2 countries you hadn't planned on visiting, and consumed more Irish coffee than was strictly necessary. You were exhausted. You were exhilarated. And the KLM passenger who wrote that the first night after arrival, you were floating around in your bed, accustomed as you had grown to the constant motion through the air. He wasn't exaggerating. The journey had entered your body. It stayed with you. Now let's meet the people who made all of this possible. Because behind every 7-course dinner, behind every perfectly made sleeper berth, behind every Irish coffee at Shannon, and every cockpit visit for a wide-eyed child, there were men and women whose skill and labour created the experience, and whose stories deserve telling just as much as the passengers. Start with the flight crew. A Constellation cockpit carried 4 to 5 people: captain, first officer, flight engineer, navigator, and radio operator. On polar routes, the L1649, a starliner needed 8: 4 pilots, 2 engineers, 2 navigators. These were big, complicated aircraft. They demanded a lot of hands, and of all those hands, the most important might have belonged to the flight engineer. The Constellation was, without question, the flight engineer's airplane. The FE sat behind the pilots at a panel bristling with dials, switches, and gauges, and from that position he controlled propeller pitch, fuel mixtures, carburetor heat, feathering buttons, pressurization, hydraulic systems, and electrical systems. Some of those controls the pilots didn't even have access to from the cockpit. As one TWA pilot put it, the flight engineer can do something and kill you, or not do something and kill you. Training lasted 4.5 months, 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. Starting pay was $500 a month. The job required a particular kind of person, technically gifted, nerves steady, comfortable with the idea that 4 enormous engines were perpetually trying to misbehave, and it was your job to keep them in line. Because those Wright R3350 engines were, to put it gently, difficult. They earned the Constellation a darkly funny nickname, the world's best trimotor. 3 engine landings were routine. 2 engine landings were not unheard of. The rear cylinders overheated. The magnesium crankcases could catch fire at temperatures reaching 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to burn through the wing spar in seconds. The engines had a tendency to, as mechanics said, swallow their own valves. During wartime, the time between overhauls was 100 hours. 100 hours. That's barely 2 missions. The early Constellation was grounded for 6 weeks in 1946 after a TWA training flight crashed near Reading, Pennsylvania. Over 95 engineering changes were mandated before the aircraft could return to service. And yet, and this is important, the men who flew her loved her. Flight engineer Bob Trumpolt described a night takeoff from the cockpit in words that read almost like poetry. Picture this. It's night, the engines are brought up to takeoff power, a mighty roar, and a yellow stream of fire reaches back from those big stacks. As the power is reduced for climb, the fire's stream begins to crawl back into the stacks. Suddenly, a small blue flame leaps out in a long yellow trail of fire. The fire was normal. The fire was what happened when you pushed 18 cylinders of superheated gasoline to their limits and beyond. Passengers sometimes saw it too, those blue and yellow exhaust flames trailing past the windows in the dark. Legend has it that on every nighttime flight, at least one passenger pressed the call button to warn the stewardess that an engine was on fire. And sometimes they were right. Behind the scenes, the maintenance effort was enormous. A TWA mechanic recalled that every night before the London flight, one mechanic was assigned to each of the 4 engines. His job? Replace all 36 spark plugs, check magneto timing, synchronize the fuel injection pumps, and service the 60-gallon oil tank with its bucket-sized filter. 4 engines, 144 spark plugs, every single night. Now consider the cabin crew. A typical Constellation carried just 2 or 3 flight attendants for the entire journey, a journey that might last 16 hours or more. TWA's first transatlantic service in February 1946 had exactly 2 crew members serving 36 passengers, purser Don Shemwell and hostess Ruth Schmidt. 2 people, 7-course dinners, sleeper berths, cocktails, 16 hours. The airlines hired women who were, in the language of the era, pretty, slim, young and single, under 28, under 5'8", strict weight. Limits enforced by regular weigh-ins. Unmarried, because marriage meant automatic termination. No glasses. Nice hands. TWEI. In the 1960s, accepted fewer than 1% of applicants. 1%. That was a harder admission rate than Harvard. Flight attendants were exclusively white until 1957, when Ruth Carroll Taylor broke the barrier at Mohawk Airlines. The uniforms reflected the era's contradictions, restrictive expectations dressed up in high fashion. Howard Greer designed TWA's famous cutout uniform with a stylized TWA cut near the right shoulder, a flap that could be buttoned down to hide the letters when the hostess was off duty, so she could smoke without being identified as airline personnel. Later, the uniforms came from names that belonged in fashion magazines: Oleg Cassini and Ralph Lauren for TWA, Christian Dior for Air France, Pierre Balmain for Olympic Airways. The reality behind the glamour was extraordinary. TWA flight attendants, as one account put it, could cook Chateaubriand medium rare, deliver a baby at 35,000 feet, and survive a plane crash, all the while immaculately dressed from their never-a-strand out-of-place hairstyles down to their mandatory high-heeled shoes. They served a world, and they did it in heels. Every beautiful story carries shadows. The Constellation's shadow fell on June 30th, 1956, over the Grand Canyon. TWA Flight 2, an L-1049, a Super Constellation carrying 70 passengers and crew, departed Los Angeles for Kansas City that morning. United Flight 718, a Douglas DC-7, departed 3 minutes later for Chicago. Both aircraft were cruising at 21,000 feet in uncontrolled airspace, navigating by visual reference. There was no radar tracking them, no air traffic control managing their paths. Over the Grand Canyon, the 2 aircraft collided. The DC-7's left wing struck the Constellation's tail, severing it. Both aircraft plunged into the canyon. All 128 people aboard the 2 planes died. It was the deadliest aviation disaster the world had ever seen. The last radio transmission from United 718, decoded painstakingly over the following 2 weeks, carried a few terrible words, and in the background, shouts of "pull up" that ended in silence. The Grand Canyon collision changed the course of American aviation. Public outrage was enormous. Congress acted. The Federal Aviation Administration was created in 1958, directly as a consequence of this disaster. The positive radar control of airspace that we take for granted, the system that tracks every commercial aircraft in the sky and ensures that none of them occupy the same space at the same time, grew from the wreckage of TWA Flight 2 and United Flight 718. The crash site is now a National Historic Landmark. This was the Constellation's heaviest chapter. There were other incidents, a Pan Am L-049 that crashed in the Syrian desert in 1947, where a young Pan Am officer named Gene Roddenberry pulled survivors from the burning wreckage, an experience so harrowing that he eventually left aviation entirely and channeled his imagination into creating Star Trek. A flying Tiger Line constellation that vanished over the Pacific in March 1962 with 107 people never found. And yet people kept flying, people kept loving the Constellation because the airplane was not its worst moments. It was all the moments in between, the caviar and the Irish coffee, and the child in the cockpit, and the exhaust flames trailing through the night. It was, in its way, human. Flawed and beautiful and trying very hard, like all of us. The most beautiful version of the Constellation, the L-1649A Starliner, entered service on June 1st, 1957. She was the final expression of everything Lockheed and Kelly Johnson had learned. Longer wings, more powerful engines, additional sound insulation that made her cabin the quietest of any Constellation. She could fly non-stop from California to Europe. On October 1st and 2nd, 1957, a TWA Starliner flew from London to San Francisco without stopping. 23 hours and 19 minutes, a piston engine record that has never been broken. Only 44 Starliners were ever built. Lufthansa's 4 offered senatorial service with just 40 passengers aboard. She had 16 months. On October 26, 1958, Pan American World Airways launched transatlantic service with the Boeing 707. The jet cruised at 540 miles per hour, nearly twice the Constellation's speed. It flew at 35,000 feet, far above the turbulence and weather that still troubled propeller aircraft. The crossing from New York to London shrank from 18 hours to 7. Reporters aboard the inaugural flight marveled at the absence of noise and vibration. Absence of noise and vibration. After years of Wright cyclones banging and sputtering and trailing fire, the jet offered something no one had quite imagined. Quiet, smooth, fast, effortless quiet. The Constellation never had a chance. Within 3 to 5 years, every major airline had retired Constellations from their premier routes. The timeline was swift. TWA, Pan Am and BOAC transitioned to 707s between 1958 and 1960. TWA retired its last transatlantic Starliner in 1961. On April 6, 1967, TWA ground service personnel placed a small booklet on every passenger seat aboard the remaining propeller flights. Its title, Props Are for Boats. On May 11, 1967, a TWAL-749A flew from Philadelphia to Kansas City. It was the last scheduled Constellation flight TWA ever operated. Eastern retired its final Super Constellation from the Air Shuttle in February 1968. And in 1993, a small Dominican Republic carrier called Aerochago SEA operated the last commercially scheduled Constellation flight, 50 years, almost to the month after the type's first flight. After the major airlines let them go, the Constellations followed a path that was, if you cared about them, hard to watch. Sold to cargo operators. Passed. Along to small Caribbean and Latin American airlines, then to scrap yards, mass scrappings in Kansas City, Lancaster, Miami. The airplane that had carried Cary Grant and President Eisenhower and 7-course dinners on Rosenthal China became a freighter, a crop duster spare parts source, and in at least one documented case, a marijuana airdrop platform. Of 856 Constellations built, roughly 55 survive. Most sit in museums or in fields or in hangars where volunteers spend their weekends trying to keep them from disappearing entirely. Only 2 or 3 remain airworthy. A single Super Constellation, a C-121C, maintained by the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society in Illawarra, Australia, painted in Qantas livery, still flies. One airplane circling over the Australian coast, carrying the memory of an entire era on its wings. General Douglas MacArthur's personal L-749, named Bataan, was restored and took to the air again in June 2023, appearing at EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. The Columbine II, the Constellation that served as President Eisenhower's Air Force One, the first aircraft to carry that call sign, flew again in March 2016, decades after being sold in a 5-plane lot for $35,000 and used as a source of crop-dusting spare parts. A Smithsonian researcher had to identify it. Eisenhower's own granddaughter, Mary Jean, helped with the restoration. And then there is the one that feels most like a fable, L1649. A Starliner N8083H was delivered to TWA in 1958, the last year anyone was buying propeller airliners. She flew passengers for a few years, then passed through a succession of owners, each one further from the glamour of the original. By 1983, she had been modified to airdrop marijuana over remote landing strips in Central America. She ended up stuck in the mud with a damaged propeller at a field in Colombia, abandoned in Honduras, rescued in 1986, left rusting in Maine for decades. Today, she is the Connie cocktail. Lounge at the TWA Hotel at JFK Airport in New York. You can walk through the same fuselage where passengers once dined on beluga caviar and Chateaubriand, sit on restored banquettes and order a craft cocktail while jazz plays from speakers tucked into the overhead bins. The airplane that nobody wanted to keep flying has become a place where people come voluntarily to sit inside and remember. There is something almost too perfect about that. This is, after all, an airplane that was born from one man's insistence on beauty. Howard Hughes didn't just want a fast airplane, or a profitable airplane, or a reliable airplane. He wanted people to stop and stare. And they did. On tarmacs, from LaGuardia to Shannon to Sydney, they stopped and stared at the dolphin-curve, the triple tail, the proud stance of the landing gear. Kelly Johnson gave it shape. Ward Beeman gave it those impossible compound curves. Raymond Loewy gave it style. The flight engineers gave it their vigilance, night after night, watching those temperamental right cyclones and coaxing them into compliance. The stewardesses gave it grace, carving roast beef in high heels, mixing salads tableside, tucking passengers into sleeper berths at 2 a.m. over the mid-Atlantic. And the passengers? They gave it their stories. The businessman who arrived in London feeling that he'd been somewhere, not merely transported. The 10-year-old who visited the cockpit and spent the next 40 years as a pilot. The young secretary in her sleeper berth, too excited to sleep, peering through a porthole at the blackness of the Atlantic Ocean, while the sound of laughter drifted up from below. Orville Wright, 72 years old, sitting at the controls of an airplane whose wings stretched longer than the distance of his first flight, running the plane for a minute, then letting the machine take care of itself. The Constellation was not a perfect airplane. Its engines caught fire, its cabins filled with cigarette smoke. It was loud and expensive, and, in the end, too slow for the world that was coming. It had 16 months of glory in its finest form before the jets arrived and made it obsolete. But for a little more than a decade, from 1946, when TWA's Star of Paris lifted off from LaGuardia, bound for the city, whose name she carried, to the late 1950s, when the last Starliners made their final crossings, the Constellation did something no airplane had done before, and none has done quite the same way since. It made the crossing of an ocean feel like an occasion. It made the journey itself a destination. It invited you to dress up, sit down, be served dinner on fine china, watch the exhaust flames trail past your window in the dark, step off at Gander into a wall of cold Newfoundland air, warm yourself with Irish coffee at Shannon as the sun rose over the green fields of County Clare, and arrive in Paris or London feeling that something had happened to you, that you hadn't just moved from one place to another, that you'd experienced something worth remembering. An entire era of flight fits inside that dolphin-shaped fuselage. The era when the journey was the thing. The engines have gone quiet now, all but one, the last Super Constellation still flying, circling over Illawarra, Australia, carrying on its triple-tailed frame the memory of everything the Connie was. It won't fly forever. One day, it too will come to rest, but the shape will remain. That curve, those three tails, the silhouette that stopped people on tarmacs halfway around the world, and in a cocktail lounge at JFK, inside the fuselage of a starliner that once ran drugs and now serves gin and tonics, travellers will sit where passengers once sat, and they'll feel something they can't quite name. A warmth, a wistfulness, the faintest sense that something beautiful passed through the world, and that we were lucky it was here.